the meeting to order. Roll call.
Ms. Macau,
Finally here.
Mrs. Darrow,
Here.
Mr. Walker,
Here.
Mr. Ergens,
Here.
Mr. Rastegar.
Here.
All right. Are there any changes or additions to the agenda? Nope. All right. Seeing none, we'll move forward. Apologize for my tardiness. Sometimes the faster you go, the more behind you get. So, thanks everybody for coming today. Today's presentation is really the first chance for the board to hear this information and ask questions. So we're going to reserve today for the board. And then we will host a presentation of findings where Johnson will come into town again. And he'll be here on October 16th from 2 to 4, and it'll be in room 420. So we encourage you to come during that time, and it'll be open to stakeholders and public to ask questions at that point in time. So board, feel free to ask questions throughout the presentation as they come up, right?
Absolutely,
Okay.
please, yep.
Great.
Love the dialogue.
In this market analysis, it really is going to help us with the data to drive our decisions for the future with our limited resources that we do have. And then we will be beginning to work on our strategic plan in October with the anticipation of presenting an update to that strategic plan during the November meeting, which is November 20th. So that's kind of the plan. With that, let's move forward with the approval of the regular minutes dated August 26th.
I'll make a motion to approve the regular minutes dated August 26th.
Second.
All those in favor?
Aye.
All right. Any opposed? All right. Okay, on to the monthly activity and finance report. Cody?
Thank you, Madam Chair, directors of the board, members of the public, and Johnson Consulting for being here today. I'm excited to get through my report so that the star of the hour can really get shown here with the information that we've been presented, and excited to get that report done. Obviously, reporting September, I'm reporting operating results through August of 2025. Couple just brief highlights here as I always start out the meeting. Obviously, Hialdi in 2025 hadn't been here since 2015. You'll see those numbers impacted on the August report for STR, for occupancies, ADRs, and then also the hotel tax collection. So I think it had a great impact for the city of Boise, the downtown core. And then on the far right here, I have a picture of our longest standing employee of Stacy Funk celebrating 35 years at our all staff meeting. So I just wanted to recognize her. She's actually celebrating in Hawaii right now, not from the 35 years, but taking some vacation time and in Hawaii right now. So our longest employee, and excited to celebrate her, and got a chance to have a really great all staff meeting where we share our highlights for the year, kind of forward projections for next year. And the staff was really, really excited to kind of look at the year that we've had and then look at next year as well. So monthly events report, we had a total of 14 events in August, with 2 of those being banquets, 1 consumer public show, 5 conventions, which is awesome for August, 5 meetings, and then 1 social. So as you can see, from what we had originally forecasted 11, we actually came in at 14, so we're out producing again the total number of events forecasted from the year. Right now we're sitting at 202, and where we would have been out on that forecast is 187. So again, a lot of those, and I've spoke to this in prior meetings, we picked up some additional small meetings from the Grove Hotel while they were under construction and things like that, that really impacted, then some short-term bookings that we've added within the year that weren't anticipated. Again, attendance numbers continue to be really strong, but I'll just point to the August numbers here, being really, really strong historically compared to August, and you'll see that there, that orange line for fiscal year 2025 on August. We came in at over 16,600 people into the building, or we welcomed over 16,000 people, 16,600 people into the building. Most of those being through the Boise Public Library Comic Arts Fest that brought in over 10,000 people over 2 days. And then we had one of our largest trade shows with Shamrock Food Show, bringing in over 1,300 over a 3-day period. And then a couple conferences that also brought in close to 1,000 multiple days when you count the total attendance from those. So that really drove that 16,000, which is the record on the books at this point in time for August, which is awesome. So. Sure I didn't go too far. Yep, okay. As far as our guest satisfaction rating, this is how you would rate your overall experience at Boise Center. We have several other metrics that we check on, from food and beverage to others, but this is the one at that kind of is the overarching guest satisfaction score that the board has as a goal of mine, and we continue to just be doing outstanding. I'm extremely proud of our team here. As you can see, over 91, almost 92% coming in at 5s. We had 5 4s so far on the year and 2 3s, but no 2s, no 1s. And we had 5 responses come in since the prior month, and we're averaging that 4.89 score on the overall guest satisfaction. And just thank you to my team, thank you to the leadership at Boise Center. Those are things that are really impressive to see when we continue to see those scores. As far as market strategy goes, the team, again, the sales team continues to do really well as far as they're hitting their goals. They're over their goals on future booked revenue, as you'll see, at 112%. Just shy of the economic impact, future booked economic impact. That's looking at all of the economic impact booked within this year for the future, not just for next year. So I want to highlight that. And then same thing with future booked room nights. That's looking out ahead for everything that's been booked within this year, and they're 96% of their goal. We had a chance to co-host with Visit Boise a really great Boise Meetings Pro event on August 21st, where we brought in Michael Dominguez, the Alhi president and CEO, and it was just, I'm a data nerd, and those that know me know that, and Michael is a bigger data nerd than I am, and just shared some really great content, some really great information on where market trends are going. It kind of helped me a little bit as we're working through some of our forecasting for next year as far as budgets go. It was a really great event, so hopefully, and we invited all the hoteliers downtown, and it was a great turnout for that event. Pacific Northwest chapter of International Society of Arboriculture confirmed for September 2026 with an estimated of 650 room nights and 380,000 in economic impact. So again, some nice wins for the month. And then as we continue to look at these are the same charts that really show where we're at year to date, and then where we were at year to date prior being that purple bar. Obviously the teal is just the current month and where we're at from the last month, and forecasting again, or what we've booked in future booked economic impact. Again, future years, not just for next year. Same thing with revenue. Future booked revenues are all into the future years, but booked within this year, and then future booked room nights. So again, outpacing the year-to-date prior. Some of this stuff is exciting because, again, you'll see it in much more color and depth as far as the Johnson report and kind of what we're doing on that side of things. So excited to get to that. A few operational updates. As I mentioned, the Shamrock Food Show is one of our largest trade shows of the year. And as far as largest goes, not necessarily population or the attendees that show up, the amount of booths we have and then the complexity to those booths. The food show drives a lot of power needs, so we bring in electricians and make sure that they're not overloading circuits and popping those. And then the kitchen is just a highly activated space. You want to talk about multiple chefs in a kitchen? That event would be the example of that. But they do a great job in making sure that they're taking care of the building as best as possible, but it is chaos. Organized chaos is what I'd call it at that point in time.
How many booths do you have?
I don't know that right off the top of my head. I don't know if any of our team knows that either right off the top. I can get you that answer by next month, but I'm guessing it's over 100 at this point, but yeah. Some are larger, so I'm not quite sure, because we have some that take over a big footprint inside that trade show floor. As far as Boise Public Library's event, that's what I mentioned, drove a lot of those attendance numbers. They brought in over 10,000 attendees over a weekend. And so I got a nice little photo there of a couple folks that were walking through the building. Those are always interesting shows to see the people's outfits and what's going on at those types of events. As far as our front and center, Boise Center's in-house food and beverage, we hosted the Albertsons Open Dinner in August, as that was our largest food and beverage event. We brought in over 800 people. We hosted ZZ Top, is that photo there. Really great event, and again, that whole tournament brings in quite a few people, but also we get the chance to host the business meeting in the morning and then the Albertsons Open Dinner in the evening. And then we also had really great feedback from Boise Metro Chamber's governor's address, which was really great attendance, but also I did get emails from several of the downtown neighbors just letting me know that they had a great event and a great meal at that event, so I'd recognize our culinary team's efforts for that. As far as Boise Center operating revenues, I continue to almost amaze myself a little bit with how close to budget and what our operational revenues are coming in at. So again, forecasting actuals this year was the challenge from the board to get as close to possible as reality. Well, I'll tell you, we are literally $1,500 or about $1,500 within budget. So a 0.02% variance to actual to forecast on that. And again, you'll see throughout the year, we had a July that was a little slower. August wasn't quite what 2023 was, but a little bit better than 22 and then better than 24. So again, it just shows you kind of the years. It just matters when we can book that business. Convention business, big banquets will tend to drive those revenues up the most and create that. But again, the forecasting continues to come in right on par with what we expected. As far as our gross profit and our margins are concerned, we're right now sitting at 16.1%. That doesn't concern me with the goal being at 20%, and the reason being is our fourth quarter is our strongest quarter. These last 2 months on the gross profit margins are our lowest of the year. So that kind of just shows you that we're going to recover strong off of that. But the last 2 months, that was a pretty flat gross profit and gross margin this last month. The month before, it took a dip about 4 points, and that was that July being a little bit slower. And then if I go back, and you'll just see that in the revenues there for that July, how low that was. And so as we're carrying the staff levels that we are, things like that, if we don't have the building utilized, that's when those numbers don't come in as strong as I'd hope. But that's what this report's going to kind of guide us. And again, we can continue to look at those numbers, but I do believe that that goal of 20% will be achievable by the end of the fiscal year. As far as economic impact numbers go, we're continuing to be extremely proud of what we're able to do for the community and the surrounding area. August economic impact alone was generated about $4.5 million for the events held at Boise Center. Total year to date for economic impact, we're sitting at 38.5, so we're right on pace and actually outperforming. When I forecast the rest, we will hit that goal, I anticipate, and slightly over from that. And that was similar to last year because we were projecting somewhat of a flat year. But again, we continue to see some nice returns on those revenues for this year and economic impact as well. Just a brief couple updates for the district side. We've talked about this, but Credible Advantages is going to assist with the updating of the strategic plan process to start in October with the goal of having that wrapped up by the November board meeting. And that strategic plan will be guided by the data that we're going to see today, so I just want to make sure that the public understands that. And then a presentation of findings event, as we mentioned, will be held on October 16th. That'll be in room 420 at 2 p.m. And that is the opportunity for the public to ask questions, kind of understand the presentation of findings that Johnson's report has and how that data came to be. As far as Boise Center's exec team, we completed a level 400 FEMA training, and this is part of our crisis communications plan. So this kind of got into everything from incident commander type of reporting. So if our facility was needed for a massive crisis, making sure that we can coordinate with other public entities or other cities or other agencies, whether it be federal, state, or local, and that we understand the verbiage and the technology and the terminology and all the things that they're going to use when they come in on a site like that, that we can best support them in a crisis communication plan. And then obviously Boise Center's fiscal year 25-26 budgeting is underway. I had a finance committee meeting this last month with the finance committee, and that is TM and Chase, and got a chance to present the preliminary findings of what I'm seeing for next year's budget. Again, we're looking at a really, really strong revenue year, record revenue year next year. Last year was probably our high water mark at this point in time at $11.9 million in forecasted revenues. This year I'm forecasting 11.3 to 11.5, so we won't quite hit that. But what I'm looking at for fiscal year 26 is about 13.5, 13.3 to 13.5 right now. We're still finalizing that, but most of the revenues have been forecasted. Now we're just going through our variable costs and making sure all that's budgeted correctly between now and October.
And it seems like your forecasting model is pretty spot on.
It is.
Based on where we are this year.
Yes.
He's gonna go market it.
My team thinks I'm Rain Man, and I'm far from it.
He
That's what
is,
they know.
yeah.
But,
New nickname, Rain Man.
data, honestly, it's science behind it, and there's a lot of data, so there's not a bunch of guessing. It's a bunch of numbers coming up with those. So with that, getting into the lodging room revenue side of things, again, August room revenues were $24 million. What I highlight on this slide, especially with so many people on the public side, this is not the tax revenues from the auditorium district. This is the total room revenues, excuse me, within set one of the STR report, which is mostly the city of Boise, some properties in Garden City like the Riverside counted into that as well. And with those revenues, you can start seeing the demand, and this is what I really want to highlight here as you see that August orange line for the demand. Again, that really speaks to Hialdi, I believe, in that, with the amount of demand that we saw in August. So we're excited to see that much demand. As you can see, it is a high water mark for the last 4 years, and that continues to be exciting to see those numbers come in on the lodging room demand. Again, within mostly the city of Boise is what set one is referencing in this data here. As we get into these, I tend to like to kind of highlight ADRs of this fiscal year, highlight these so you can see them pop out a little bit better. But as you'll see, we're slightly pacing above stronger ADRs than the prior years, coming in about $163 for August. And then you can see it layered over the top. So things are very similar, but there is some slight market adjustments. And occupancies are kind of staying right about flat when you get into those. So I'll click those down here on the occupancy side. Get this correct here. you'll start seeing there at 79%, 79.3, and that's very similar to the prior years when you get into the other occupancies, and you can highlight those and you'll see. 24 was a high water mark on that one with 82%, 79.3, and 79.8, so they're all staying within about 2 to 3% variance on the occupancies. And then this is a fixed slide that I report each month to the board. Again, it'll get updated with 26's numbers as we finish off on 25, but it's just kind of how I forecast from those tax revenues, and what we're seeing is a little bit of that leveling off, and you can kind of see it as you step back from the whole picture, looking all the way back to 2016 at what occupancies and ADRs we're doing, that top line being ADR and that bottom line being occupancies. Some of this data is also inside Johnson's report, so I won't spend too much time on that. That, I stand for any questions before I hand it over to Stephanie for the financial report.
Any questions? Nope. Stephanie?
Good afternoon. Oops. I don't know, it's not working.
I'll move it forward for you.
Okay, good. It's not working.
Okay, sorry.
You gotta keep going, because yeah.
Hold on, it was unplugged in the back. That might have been my mistake, so now you should have control.
Okay. Revenues for Boise Center, just a little over $8 million. District, we're at 9.5. Expenses, you can see the revenue and expenses for Boise Center, 5.5 million, just a little bit over, and we had budgeted for 6.4. So currently Boise Center is outperforming the budget by about $882,000, which is really good news. District is the opposite of that, just at, it's a little, it's like negative 845,000, but I think that has to do with some of the capital expenditures. So there are the aquatics numbers. Nope, it's still not working.
Okay, I'll move you forward.
Okay. The financial overview, what makes up those revenues, Cody alludes to in his previous slides. The room sales, you can see year-to-date revenues, 1.5. Other revenue, 372,000. Beverage revenue, 687. Food revenue is a little over 3.8 million, and the AV revenue is just shy of 1.5 million. And he's right, the difference between those operating revenues and what he budgeted for is just $1,527. That does not take into consideration the depreciation and the other stuff, but it is, there we go. All right, yay.
Power again.
I love it. Hotel tax collections, the hotel tax revenues forecasted for our fiscal year 2025 was 11.9. August, we brought in 1.16 million. If we continue at this pace, we will hit just over $12 million for the year. These are your transfers. And I still hate this slide. We're redoing the slides for you guys, but it will be the new fiscal year because with everything going on, the budget, performance reviews, all those fabulous things here at the last couple months of this fiscal year, this will be one that is changed, just so I can get a cadence with regards to the transfers that are coming from the district into the Boise Center, to where there's a little more rhyme and reason with regards to it. But this is what makes up your transfers and how they've looked the last couple of years. Your investments, the number that you guys always love to see over there highlighted in the red is your interest income. Those are just off of the Clearwater Investments account. And then our district cash position, currently with cash and investments, close to $36 million. And minus your restricted funds of $250,000, your stabilization fund for any unforeseen expenses is $6 million. So cash available for projects at this time is $29,718,000. That is it. Any questions?
Any questions?
All right.
Seeing none, I'd entertain a motion to approve.
So moved.
Do I have a second?
Second.
All those in favor? Aye. Any opposed? All right. Thank you, Stephanie. Cody?
Yeah, I want to.
All right, now on to the main event.
I'll take a minute to do a quick introduction real quick of Johnson Consulting. We engaged Johnson Consulting through an RFP process that Pine Street Group helped us with back in the spring. And then Ryan Johnson and John Fleming have been leading the project and getting this data together. Want to kind of just briefly explain kind of a level set as to why the district chose to go about this process, and really to just better understand the opportunities for future investments. As the board chair alluded to, limited resources, and so we're looking at through those opportunities at expanding existing facilities, developing new spaces, what might be the best option investment for the district to make going forward. And so again, just kind of wanted to make sure the public understands the why part of it. They'll get into the how as they would go through this process, and then I'll kind of wrap up at the end and kind of let everybody know what next steps are about that process. But what I would just highlight here is what this report is not today is a decision point for the board to make a decision on any particular project. So I just want to make sure, because I get a lot of people calling me asking, hey, what project are you going to be doing as of Thursday? That's not what this is as far as the report. It will guide those decisions. So I just want to clarify that and then say thank you to Johnson Consulting for all their hard work on this process. And Ryan, take it from here.
Great. Well, thank you, Cody. Excuse me, Madam Chair and board members. It's great to see you all again. I can't believe it's been about 6 months since we last met for the kickoff. So just by way of reintroduction, I'm Ryan Johnson with Johnson Consulting. I'm the principal and practice leader for our convention center and hospitality practice. I'm also joined virtually by John Fleming. I don't know if, John, you want to introduce yourself again?
Thanks, Ryan. John Fleming. I'm a project manager with Johnson Consulting, and it's been a pleasure getting to work with you all as well as with Cody and his team throughout the process of this market feasibility study.
And so we'll just get right into it. But I do want to say, a special thanks to Cody and his team. There's been a tremendous amount of data and research that we've gone through, and they've really helped provide us with the level of input and information that we've needed to do our research. So let me advance the slide here. So we have an agenda. Hopefully this will be about a 45-minute presentation overall. Those first few bullet points really help outline how we got to the recommendations and the overall feasibility assessment by land use that we looked at. And then also going to be sharing some projections and impacts for the top two recommended land uses. So with that being said, really just like to help frame what the project goals are. Cody mentioned, looking at a variety of opportunities, but first and foremost, your main asset right now is the Boise Center. So how can we optimize this facility? What are some of the physical changes? Are expansion opportunities warranted? Then also there's some other opportunities from a facilities perspective. So there's been a recalibration of booking policy. So some local events have shifted out or had not as much opportunity compared to convention or conference events. So is a more local sister events facility warranted? And also another big gap in the market is a potential multi-purpose sports facility. And then the performing arts community, there's been a kind of a paradigm shift with some of the existing assets in the performing arts venue space here in Boise. So really understanding how the local arts organizations are being impacted and what opportunities there are for a new facility focused on performing arts. And then just as a reminder, the graphic on the right side highlights the current location of the Boise Center and then also the geographic boundaries of the Greater Boise Auditorium District. So I really like to start going through and talking a little bit about our methodology and how we get to where we are today with the recommendations that we developed. So there's really 4 pillars that we really focus on. First and foremost is our market and historical operations analysis. So how are the economic and demographics of the market performing? What's the city and the surrounding area doing? How's this building performing? Really important for us to understand the performance here. So the number of events, the activity, the number of attendance, the various event types that are occurring, and then also really understanding, lost business is another major component of the work that we, of the data that we looked at, and also really focusing in on how the hotels are performing and supporting the group business that you all are trying to attract. So that's pillar 1. Our next pillar is really our stakeholder and organizational engagement. So since the beginning of this process, we've engaged with over 35 different organizations and about 2 to 3 individuals for each of those focus groups. So anywhere between 60 to 90 folks that we've engaged with. And those range from facility management, building users, lost business customers or potential customers, the city, Boise State University, arts organizations, economic development folks, hoteliers, business leaders. So really focusing on people that interface with this building in particular and seeing what, opportunities or limitations are currently presented by this building and also the overall marketplace. So that's pillar 2. Pillar 3 is really looking at the macro level, what's happening in the convention, sports, and performing arts industries from a national and even an international level. And as I was talking about, or I mentioned at our meeting earlier, with the booking policy that's really been enacted with Cody and his team, I think they're really at the forefront of some of the trends that we're seeing with really optimizing those room night generating activities in the building, and also really focusing on how, even though that's the priority, how local events can still really be part of the, the event mix here. So then the final pillar is our benchmarking and case study work. So here we look at peer destinations, understanding from, a market perspective and a facilities perspective, what types of venues do they have and how does that compare to what you have? And, as we'll go through, in the set that we've identified, there's actually a number of deficiencies here in the Boise market compared to these other destinations. So, and we'll get into that. But these 4 pillars really help set the stage and lead us to the foundation of our strategic recommendations. And then once those recommendations are in place, that allows us to understand and to develop and project future demand and financial performance for an expanded Boise Center, for example, or a potential new multi-purpose indoor sports facility. And John, if you have anything you'd like to chime in, or if you all, the board, have any questions as we're going through, please chime in. So just at a high level, I think, sorry, I'm clicking on 2 different places. So from an executive summary perspective, Boise Center is really at capacity. You can't accommodate more events of any type really than what you're doing. And it's a very highly successful operation. I think the 3 key limitations that we've identified are date availability, size, and also hotel inventory in terms of committable room block to some of the larger events. And as you all know, the Boise market from an economic and demographic perspective is one of the most dynamic in the country. Your population growth, the income growth, and also the economy that you have here is very well diversified and a very strong destination from a business and an economic cluster perspective. Again, those facility gaps are really primarily exhibit space. You have good ballroom space and great meeting room space in this building, but it's really that larger exhibit space that we've identified as a key gap. And then also the indoor sports opportunities to enter into the sports tourism market's also a gap. A lot of like-sized communities like yours have that sports tourism indoor multi-purpose facility. And one of the reasons why that's important is the way they utilize hotel rooms throughout the week. Conventions, conferences compete largely with the corporate hotel room night generation activities, whereas sports tourism really focuses on more of that Thursday through Sunday hotel opportunity, which is, I think, a huge opportunity for the hotels. And then also, as Cody identified, you all have a finite amount of resources. So where is the most opportune and the highest impact place for you all to invest in the future of your community here and for the district? And John, do you want to go through here and talk a little bit about the current conditions?
Yeah, absolutely. And apologies, I've got the deck on my other screen, so I keep looking to my left to make sure that I can kind of reference it across. But I think really what this slide summarizes is a shift in the operational strategy of Boise Center over the last several years. prior to COVID, I would say, there was sort of a success metric around total utilization being the goal for the building. So how many meetings can we drive through here? How many events can we drive through here, et cetera? And that's been shifted, deliberately by the board and by the Boise Center's leadership towards, how can we make sure that we're generating revenue, generating economic impact for the building and for the Boise and greater Boise community. And so, the way that we see that sort of reflected in the data is two sides. One is that there are fewer total events now, and when I say now, I mean fiscal year 24, than we saw prior to COVID, right? So dropping from that 330, 340, 350 range to about 260 is where it's stabilized. And actually, it's been remarkably stable in terms of total events the last few fiscal years for which we have data. But the flip side of that, if you see sort of the room nights on that chart on the bottom right, and just so you all know, these page numbers that we have under there, those are where you can find those in the report. So if you want to cross-reference while we're going along, you can do that. But what you see is the room nights have upticked about 50% above pre-COVID levels. And room nights are really a good kind of proxy, I would say, for overall economic impact. Because what room nights are saying is we're driving out-of-town people to the market. We're bringing in new spending that's going to our hotels, to our restaurants, to our retail businesses, and eventually trickling down into wages, into indirect spending, and into jobs sustained and created within the Boise economy. So, I think this is an important place to start because it really just contextualizes where Boise Center has been and where they are today in terms of operational strategy and level of success. And we'll get a little bit further into that as we move on. Ryan, if you want to go to the next slide here.
Yep. So yeah, I'd really like to focus here on some of the limitations of this building, in particular, the Boise Center. Lost business is one of the most important resources we have as an analytical tool to really define kind of the lost opportunities that you could recapture with additional space or more data availability. So I really do apologize how small the numbers are for our folks here in the audience, but this top chart here really focuses on total historic lost events. So this is all event types in particular. And I just want to focus in on this number, which is impossible to read, but it's 431 total events were lost. And there's really about 8 or so different reasons why that people could select for the different events that are considering the Boise Center. So really focusing on data availability is the key one, and also not having that large enough space to service their event. And then also the hotel limitations is another key factor. And the bottom chart in particular really focuses in specifically on the convention and conference lost events. And that really is a significant number. A subset of that 431 specific to convention and conferences is about 177 events that are lost on an annual basis. And I think a really important point to make with this chart, these events that are considering the Boise Center understand, or they'll find out very quickly, that there is not an exhibit hall or there's not a large enough space to accommodate their event. So from our experience and our research, there's a tremendous amount of events that don't even consider the Boise Center in its current size and configuration. So this is just a small slice of what we think the overall area of opportunity is for attracting events to a larger facility. And this next slide really harkens back and, really appreciate the financial, acumen of your team here, but the performance, really want to highlight a few key areas of growth. The food and beverage growth has been really dynamic and substantial and very important to the bottom line of the operations here. And also highlighting, you have a good amount of room rental revenue, but you're also, and it's growing, and how much you're getting off of the space you do have, but it's limited also by the size and the spaces you have to sell. And you also have a very strong AV and equipment rental operation, and that's been growing very strongly as well. And just to highlight from in 2024 is about a $12 million revenue operation, And then on the expense side, it's about 14.7 million. So you do have an annual deficit that's incurred. But as we've looked at other facilities, and as is common with convention centers throughout the country, convention centers are loss leaders, and that's really a way for the community to have a facility that can provide economic impact that's greater than the subsidy that's required to support operations on an annual basis. Yes, please.
Do you have an idea of what those other convention centers lose as a percentage?
Sure.
It's like 19% over revenue?
So it really depends, and I think that's a great question, and there's a lot of nuance to that. So if you're familiar with the hotel industry, there's a standard chart of accounts that every hotel utilizes when they look at their revenue and expense statements. Convention centers are different. So really getting that apples to apples understanding, and then also understanding certain venues have different revenue streams that you all don't have. So you all, for example, don't have parking revenue. Some buildings actually are authorities that own hotels, so they get revenue from the hotel's operating profit. But on a like basis of similar district-run facilities, it's on par with what we're seeing at other peer venues, if not lower, actually, than some that we've seen. So,
And the thing I would add to that is, we'll often look at sort of financial metrics on a per square foot basis, and this is broken down in greater detail in the report. But what we found when we looked at Boise Center is that on a per square foot basis, it actually performs extremely strongly in terms of revenue per square foot. High on the expense side too, but that really is reflective again of the level of service being provided. Even with sort of a smaller building, relative to some of the comparable facilities that we looked at.
and I agree, the revenue you're able to drive on a per square foot basis is really outstanding, given the small size of the space. So now we're going to look at some of the key market factors here. So really focusing on the economic and demographics of the market. A couple different charts up here. The top left here really just summarizes what the other charts are displaying, which is really rapid population and income growth, strong levels of educational attainment, and also a stable base of both public sector employment as well as private sector. And as you are taking a look at the report, this table right here in the upper right is really interesting to us. And this identifies the various industry sectors. And there's a heat map focused on the location quotient. So we're comparing Boise to the United States average. So anything over 1 is a stronger economic sector here in Boise. And, we were talking with the sales team and really identifying those industry sectors that are strongest here really help link and drive events to these types of facilities. So that is a really important piece of information to tie the events happening at the Boise Center to your local economy. John, do you want to talk about some of the gaps we've identified?
Absolutely. I think thinking about kind of the market and the inventory of different facility types in the market, as Ryan mentioned at the top of the presentation, we were looking at a few different things primarily within our scope of work. One being trying to understand the conference and convention space picture, another being local event space, multi-purpose sports complex, and then the fourth being, performing arts space. And I think kind of going one by one there, what we found is that Boise Center and really the market as a whole lacks a true exhibit hall. And as we'll get to when we discuss our case studies and benchmarking work, it's pretty unusual. It stands out pretty significantly among comparable markets. Boise Center's sort of deficit in this respect. And this kind of limits capacity to host major conventions. When your largest space within the facility is in the 25,000 square foot range, relative to a competitor like Spokane, where they're looking at 100,000 square foot exhibit hall. Salt Lake City is even larger in that respect. It is a limiter when you're competing for some of these big box conventions that drive high amounts of room nights, economic impact, et cetera. So though the facility is performing extremely well, I think it's a pretty significant gap in our minds. Then looking a little bit at the local event space side of things, really we do see sort of a limitation in that respect. And, I think that's reflected by how busy Boise Center is there's a lot of local groups in addition to out of town groups that are trying to get into the facility, and utilize that facility. And then this is something that we've also heard reflected by community leaders, business people, folks who are trying to have events in and around sort of the core of Boise, is that it's a real struggle finding adequate event space. And this has become, sort of even increasingly true as that prioritization shift that we discussed a few slides previous has kind of come to fruition, and Boise Center has targeted some of those more out of town type economic impact generating events. And then on the sports complex side of things, I think this one is just a kind of very clear in our mind, is that there isn't, a true indoor multi-purpose sports complex. So, we look at Cabin Williams Sports Complex on the Boise State campus is fulfilling some of that role as it stands today. But the challenge, and I think that, you'll hear this from the folks with Visit Boise as well, is that, with university-owned facilities like that, their priority is their students and their student athletes, right? And as it should be, right? And so then to try to sell that multiple years in advance for a sports tournament is very challenging for a CVB and for a community's sort of hospitality industry. The other big one, would be the Idaho Center, and that does work for some wrestling tournaments, et cetera, but it's not really purpose built for it. It's more of an arena. It's more focused on sort of rodeo and equestrian agricultural type activity as well. So, that's a pretty clear gap. And again, one that we'll look at sort of comparable markets and how they've addressed that. Oh, go ahead, Ryan.
Yeah, and I just wanted to chime in too. I know some other areas in the broader region, the Treasure Valley, are also looking at these multi-purpose sports opportunities. So, we do have that context in mind, and we'll talk a little bit more about a strategy for that as we talk about kind of the next wave of recommendations.
So question about the exhibit hall. Did you look at the exhibit hall space that they have out at Expo Idaho?
We have.
And, okay.
It's basically, not competitive for the types of the events and conventions that you're trying to attract. That would really be more consumer show oriented in our experience. So it is factored into our thinking and our recommendations. Go ahead, John.
Okay. Then the fourth piece is, on that performing arts center, and I know Ryan referred to this earlier, but, local arts organizations, and I think towards the ballet, the orchestra, opera, et cetera, right? They're, sort of lacking that dedicated civic performing arts center. And again, this goes back to, historically, the Morrison Center has fulfilled that role, and it's a great venue, and Boise State does an excellent job operating it. But because it's a Boise State asset, the university has its own priorities. And, I think those priorities don't always necessarily align with sort of the cultural and community building priorities that a, more civic oriented performing arts center might have. And so, again, as we'll look at some of these case studies, they've, really sort of focused on that public and civic type performing arts center within their communities.
And then, so this next slide here, really thinking about the hotel performance in the marketplace. So we're looking at it from two different perspectives. The top chart's really looking at it from a district-wide perspective and the hotels and how they're performing. And you are outperforming the national average from an occupancy perspective by about 6% from a district-wide perspective. That bottom chart really focuses in on a 15-minute walking radius of the hotels that are in proximity to the Boise Center. And this is even more outperforming, the U.S. Average by about 10 points. And this walkability is really important for convention attendees, and just any event attendee prefers to be directly, connected or within walking distance to a hotel. Something to note about that, the downtown market, there's a really strong corporate demand for hotel rooms. You do have one of the higher occupancies and ADRs when you look at the competitive set. We'll talk about that. And again, the weekday versus the weekends, the days are doing great, but being able to figure out some strategies to boost the weekends is also top of mind. And we don't really have a recommendation for a hotel component to this. I think it's really important to acknowledge that there's about a 300-room hotel that's coming to market in the next, in 2026. And that's the new AC Element. And there's also a couple other hotels in the pipeline for by the airport. So I think really, focusing on that potentially in the future as there's commitment to maybe an expansion of the Boise Center would be the right time. So just kind of letting the hotel situation evolve and seeing how those rooms are absorbed would be our thought. So now getting into the benchmarking analysis. So we took a look at a number of destinations, and the chart is even more impossible to read than some of the other ones, but I think the real point we're trying to demonstrate here, one, the cities that we selected as peers, and then also the facilities that they have. In the report, you can get into all the benchmarks and the comparable data points that we looked at. And so Spokane, I think, is one of the closer regional peers of they have quite a robust convention center development with the Spokane Convention Center. And they also have the Podium, which is their indoor multipurpose sports complex. And they also have a very competitive hotel supply package. So that was kind of some of the facilities in the Spokane market. Looking at the Salt Lake market, much larger market. From a facilities perspective, they have the Salt Palace, which is one of the largest venues in the region. And they're also developing a new performing arts facility with the Miller Arts Center. And then you have the Western Sports Park for their indoor sports tourism asset. And their convention center actually also does quite a bit of sports, indoor sports tourism activity as well. So just want to point that out. And then Des Moines, capital city, they have a lot of facility infrastructure. They have the Iowa Event Center, which is both a convention center, an arena, as well as a headquarters hotel. And they're quite active in state association business, conventions, trade shows. And then they've also recently just developed, it's in West Des Moines, is where they're the new Mid-American Recplex is, and that's their new indoor sports facility. And they have a variety of cultural assets for performing arts and entertainment. And then the last peer destination we looked at is Madison, Wisconsin. They have a very strong medical. Epic is a medical company that provides a lot of infrastructure to the overall medical industry, and they're headquartered here. They've got University of Wisconsin-Madison. It's also a state capital. And so they have a few different facilities. So Monona Terrace is the most akin to the Boise Center. And that's a historic building. It was designed by Frank Lloyd Wright. So there's some expansion challenges that come along with that. So for a lot of their larger exhibit space and some of their sports space, they have the Alliant Energy Center, which is located on their fairgrounds, and they've gone through a master plan and redevelopment of that. So they really use those two facilities in tandem. And then their arts complex is the Overture Center for the Arts. So John, I don't know if there's any other points you'd like to share about, this peer set and benchmarks.
I think we kind of hit the points, the high points on the next couple of slides. So if you want to advance to the next one here, I think, really what was very impressive to us as we were kind of benchmarking some of the market characteristics of Boise versus these other markets is Boise's sort of strong performance relative to these other markets. So if you look at population growth, we're seeing, significantly more projected population growth over the next 5 years than any of these other markets. And keep in mind, Salt Lake, Des Moines, and Madison have historically been growing very quickly. So likewise with Boise growing very quickly, but Boise is expected to slow down by quite a bit less and really carry that momentum forward. And that's reflected as well as in the population chart that you see on the top right, which is, really showing that Boise is second only among that benchmark set to Salt Lake City in terms of MSA population. And even then, Salt Lake City is significantly larger, but it's not so much larger that they're not comparable. And I think that would surprise a lot of folks to learn is how much Boise's grown and how much this market has changed and sort of developed into a more premier destination within the Intermountain West. And then lastly on this chart, I'll kind of highlight the median household income, which really shows that, again, the Boise MSA and the Boise community is, right amongst these markets, many of which have, as Ryan said, significant presences of tech, higher education, certainly government, and just a lot of wealth in general, but among that that median household income metric. And if you advance to the next slide, I think, what's really resonant to us is that if you look at those benchmark metrics, right, you'd say, okay, Boise should be fairly comparable or maybe even ahead of a lot of these other markets in terms of its facility inventory. But the reality is if you look at convention center space, Boise Center is the smallest convention center that any of these markets has, right? Spokane is about 100,000 square feet larger, and that difference is purely in the form of an exhibit hall. By meeting space and ballroom space, they're very comparable. The Salt Palace is quite a bit larger, and that's a little bit different. It's a little bit of a different market. So I wouldn't necessarily say, hey, Boise Center needs to get up to that level right away. But Iowa Event Center is more comparable to Spokane, where they have, that larger exhibit hall. And then the Monona Terrace Convention Center is very comparable to Boise Center in a lot of respects. But the real difference is, and we have this kind of footnoted, is that the Alliant Energy Center is the other major facility within the Madison market. And that's sort of an arena expo hall facility that hosts UW-Madison basketball games. They host a lot of sports events, and they host a lot of sort of those bigger box conventions. So they have, a larger 125,000 square foot exhibit hall, as well as quite a bit of ballroom and meeting space at that facility as well. And so, what Madison, sort of found with Monona Terrace is, this is a great facility. It brings in a lot of great conferencing activity, but because of its location, because of its design and sort of historic and architecturally significant nature, it's unexpandable, right? And so they, in tandem with the Monona Terrace facility, the community invested in the Alliant Energy Center, which has really served as that bigger box convention center for the facility, bringing in those larger out-of-town type events. And then on the right side of this, you really see sort of the comparison in terms of that indoor multipurpose sports complex. And really what this shows is that, again, despite being comparable or even stronger than these other markets in a lot of key demographic and economic indicators, Boise is lacking that facility that those other markets have, right? Spokane has the podium. Salt Lake City has their expo facility, which does host a lot of different sporting events, as well as Western Sports Park, which is just coming online. Des Moines has the Recplex. Madison has the Alliant Energy Center, as I referred to. But Boise doesn't really have a facility that's in this range for that indoor sports tourism type opportunity. And so, I think the benchmarking kind of underscores the facility gaps that we identified previously earlier in this presentation, as really kind of emphasizing, hey, Boise, relative to its size, relative to its other characteristics, should maybe look at these facilities as its next logical step in terms of advancing its market from a destination and tourism perspective. And then, if you advance to the next slide here, I think something that people do think a lot about, and reasonably so, with regards to convention and really out-of-town travel in general, is airlift. And, is Boise accessible enough to support this kind of convention center? And that was, one of the things that we wanted to make sure to look at, because, it's a huge factor, right? And what we end up finding is that, Salt Lake City, again, it's in a different category. That airport is much larger than any of these other comps. But amongst the rest of the comps, Boise actually has the most enplanements, and it's right in the middle of the pack in terms of direct flight routes. And then in addition to that, we want to make sure to recognize the city of Boise's ongoing investments in expanding and upgrading that airport to, continue to bring it further along and grow it with Boise's growth. And so, I think in our minds, airlift can continue to be improved. And I think the biggest sort of area of improvement is, direct flights to the East Coast. Right now, the only direct to the East Coast from Boise is to Atlanta, and that's a limiting factor, right? That's a huge proportion of the country's population. That's not necessarily within a direct flight of Boise. However, we don't see that as a major limiting factor, relative to a lot of these other markets. Boise is very comparable in terms of its airlift, and obviously they've been able to sustain successful convention and event center facilities and operations. And then, go ahead, please, Ryan.
And I was just going to say, if, these smaller kind of peer set that we look at, of expansion opportunities compared to Spokane, for example, I would see Boise as better positioned to get more direct flights and more air service comparatively to Spokane, given some of the challenges that they have. And the others, Des Moines, I think, is a very strong, destination from an airlift and direct flight perspective. But Madison, you're really kind of almost a super regional hub. You're not a hub, but you really have the potential to grow into, a pretty solid, air service, destination and provider.
Ryan, can I go back a slide?
Sure.
Speaking about sports, and I know this is dedicated indoor facilities, but I've heard you mention a few of the amenities that we have, that Boise State manages. So is it that we don't have enough space, or we are not utilizing the space that we have effectively?
I would say it's more an issue of access, and then the quality level would be the two limiting factors for why we're discounting in some regards some of the infrastructure Boise State has, for example. As John mentioned, some of the ability to access that's compromised from an outside tourism and tournament use perspective, because the university controls that. They bring in some of their own tournaments and some of their own activities from that sports tourism perspective, but they're not really able to penetrate the tourism or the sports tournament rights holders. And that's the target group that you need, and really they're focused on a building they have consistent access to. So I think consistency of access is the challenge that we've identified as the challenge.
Thank you.
All right. So I think it's also important as we look at the hotel environment, and both of these charts really focus again on that 15-minute walkable hotel supply. So again, you can see the number of rooms on a comparative basis. Boise, it's great, it's growing, but I think what's really interesting for us as we think about this, when you look, and you can't see it, but the orange bar for Boise is the occupancy, the 12-month occupancy is about 73% occupancy that they're achieving for those hotels within a 15-minute walk, and then an average daily rate of about $203. So then you take a look at the hotels, for example, within a 15-minute walk of the Salt Palace, and they also have a 73% occupancy and actually a lower average daily rate than you are achieving. So I think that really, for us, helped crystallize how powerful your market opportunities are when you're performing at a level akin to Salt Lake City, and also the growth opportunities that you have.
Just a question, in these comps, did you look at the hotel brands too? Because that sometimes is important in terms of landing those bigger conventions.
Yes, absolutely. So what we've done in the actual report, we have a full breakdown of kind of a destination description where we describe the hotels that are proximate to it, and really go into more of a destination description that provides some more information. And if there's anything additional that you would like us to go into from a data research perspective, we'd be pleased to do that as well.
Yeah, and to definitely echo the sentiment around brands and sort of making sure that the right flags and products are present. It's a really important part of understanding a hotel supply and how it comports with a convention environment.
All right, so all of the data and analytics and research that we've gone through with you all, and there's a lot more there's a great level of detail in the report in addition to what we just shared, but that really helps us set the framework of why we're making the recommendations that we're we're making here. And so as we get into this, we were asked to look at, these different product opportunities, what is supportable from a market-wide perspective, not necessarily focusing on a specific location or opportunity. So how much additional exhibit space can the overall Boise metro area support? Same with these other product opportunities. So in general, most of them are market supportable and market feasible. The real question for us as we think about what we're recommending in the prioritization, what's the right use of the district's resources in supporting some of these opportunities? So, we'll go through the recommended program on the next slides, but this is just a summary slide that we have in the report. It's on page 97. But as we go to the next slide, we'll go through each one of these and talk about existing square footages, recommended additions, and then what the total would be after the addition, and some of the opportunities or challenges that we see with these recommendations. So John, do you want to walk us through these?
Absolutely, and please just let me know. I'm having some connectivity troubles, but let me know if there's any issues with my audio.
You're good.
Perfect. The first slide here is really addressing the convention space and indoor sports complex, and in our mind, those are the two real key opportunities for the auditorium district. Both relative to those being significant facility gaps, as we've discussed, and also relative to the economic impact opportunity, as we'll get into. And so on the convention space, we've sort of, in this scenario, we've looked at this as a Boise Center expansion, and I think that's ideal, but obviously there are challenges, always with expanding a building and identifying the right land and so forth. So that's not necessarily the only way that it can go. And really at this stage, we were trying to just understand, what is the market opportunity before we then get into how would we actually execute on that market opportunity. But, what we've recommended here is essentially that 100,000 square foot exhibit hall that, in our mind and from our analysis, the facility is currently lacking, right? And would bring that sort of into alignment more with Des Moines, more with Spokane in terms of overall size, but then complementing that with additional ballroom space as well as additional meeting room space to bring, the total function space, net usable function space to about 223,000 square feet. Now, something I do want to note here is, Boise Center currently has about 86,000 square feet of sellable space. But, the way that we always go just to make things apples to apples is adding up exhibit halls, ballrooms, and meeting rooms, and then no sort of support or outdoor spaces. So that's why there may be a delta in what you've seen from Boise Center's marketing materials and what we have on the screen here. But I think, really what this expansion or what this additional space would do is three primary things. And in our mind, solves a lot of the challenges that we're seeing in terms of the lost business that we're seeing at the facility. And the first is creating that additional date availability. And we're not expanding the calendar. We're not adding 100 days to the year, right? But what we are doing in terms of that date availability is enabling multiple events to be hosted at once. And this was done partially when Boise Center East was open, right? It helped host multiple events at once. This, what we're talking about would be a much larger version of that, where now you could see, even within one ballroom or another ballroom, multiple significant banquet events, convention events going on at the same time. And so effectively that's adding date availability to the calendar because you have this capacity to host more events simultaneously. The big piece of it from our perspective is enabling larger events. Going back to that lost business data, it's not a huge number in terms of raw totals of large events, conventions, et cetera, that are being lost because Boise Center isn't large enough. But the two things that contextualize that is, for one thing, a lot of events are seeing that Boise Center doesn't currently have an exhibit hall and saying it's not going to work for us. We're not even going to get on the phone with them or sort of submit a lead because there's no way that we can host our large big box convention in a building that its largest space is about 26,000 square feet. The other piece of that is that these events, even if they're not many in total raw number, they are the highest impact events that we're talking about. And so enabling the hosting of those larger events that buy out an entire facility, buy out an entire 100,000 square foot exhibit hall is hugely impactful to downtown Boise in terms of fiscal impact, tax revenue generation, spending at restaurants, retail, and hotels, et cetera. And then on the sports complex side of things, we'd be looking at, about 100,000 square foot multi-purpose hall, and that would be able to accommodate, roughly 10 full-size basketball courts, which could, convert typically into about 20 volleyball courts. That's a typical rule of thumb for indoor sports complex type facilities. We'd want to see sort of support spaces in the order of about 10,000 square feet. Those types of support spaces, it's really breakout rooms intended to serve as changing rooms for the athletes, catering spaces, et cetera, making sure that there's the sort of ancillary space available to make these events work. Catering kitchen would be an important part of that facility as well, but you don't need to necessarily run the same level of quality in terms of cost food and beverage operation. Typically these sports complexes, it's a little bit more concession oriented, and then pre-function and back of house space. And I think, this really identifies and addresses three key deficiencies that we've seen in the market in terms of, its inventory and its current challenges. The first being enabling Boise to compete more in that sports tourism market. Without that dedicated facility, it's very challenging to penetrate these, more regional tournaments that do bring in, dozens or even hundreds of teams and drive, thousands of people through the market. And what we see with sports tourism is it's not just the kids, but it's their parents as well. Sometimes it's their sister or their brother, and even extended family as well. So those can be really high impact and really meaningful. The other piece of it is that these tournaments typically happen over the course of a weekend. So you'll see a Friday, Saturday, Sunday tournament. Sometimes you'll see a week long, but what we've identified both from conversations with hoteliers as well as our own market data is that weekend occupancy at Boise's hotels is really where the opportunity lies. You're seeing a lot of business travel during the week, with the activity that's happening at Micron, obviously with the state capitol being here and sort of the associated travel with that. And then with Boise Center generating, upwards of 30,000, 35,000 hotel room nights on an annual basis. But on the weekends, when that activity dies down, that's when there's more of an opportunity to fill hotel rooms, put heads in beds. And we think that the sports complex opportunity would really be helpful for that. And then really go ahead.
Real quick, I think just to provide a higher level of context to these two opportunities, we don't think both of these should be pursued simultaneously. And if you notice, the amount of exhibit hall space we're recommending for the expansion is, roughly the same as the multi-purpose hall for the sports. So in our mind, if you focus, for example, on the Boise Center and having that exhibit hall, there's a ramp-up period that happens with getting into these larger conventions and trade shows that you would be focusing on. So there would be opportunities for sports tourism events and tournaments to happen in this new exhibit hall. And so, once that sports tourism and tournament market has been identified, there's other communities in the surrounding area that are also focusing on the sports complex, indoor sports complex development. So you all, in our judgment, should be staying focused on those conventions and trade shows. So, as that comes in year 4 and year 5, as you're really getting to where you want to be, hopefully another community's made the investment in developing their own multi-purpose sports complex of something this size that can then take some of those events that have already entered the market as well as grow and be purposely focused on the sports tournament marketplace.
That was something I was just going to ask you, because it's roughly the same square footage, right?
It is.
And it's usually, exhibit hall is usually a concrete floor, so why couldn't you use it for both? And do you have any examples of communities that do use a facility like that for both?
I would say more venues do both than not. So, for example, Virginia Beach, their convention center, they've actually now shifted their whole business model to be sports tournaments first. You see places like the Colorado Convention Center in Denver. They also have the Gaylord Rockies, which is in Aurora, and both of those are really primarily focused on the convention and trade show markets, both of those buildings, but they infill with a lot of sports tourism. So that's why we're really focusing our, recommendation largely on, expanding the exhibit hall to accommodate those higher impact events, but that infill opportunity for the sports tourism. And then once the sports tourism identifies this as a capable destination and, potentially some other community sees that proof in what you're doing here, can build something that can take that and then replace that with, more conventions and trade shows.
What is the footprint for 160,000 square feet? Do you know what that footprint looks like?
It's big. And so this right here, we're really focusing on actual function space. So I think that's a very important distinction. So there's a grossing factor that you have to apply when you're thinking about adding pre-function and support spaces, back of house spaces. That is one of the real challenges you all have here. You didn't really optimize the support spaces, the loading docks, the kitchen areas to really service this. So I don't want to give you a specific grossing factor because we're not architects, and I think it needs to be studied through that lens about what's the appropriate amount of kind of grossing factor to utilize. But you could think about potentially doubling, the square footage for a gross amount to support an expansion of this size.
And then kind of regarding the sports complex, because in reading the report, the facility in Utah is going to be, high-end, and they've got all the facilities, and it sounds like the
Sure.
one in Spokane is as well. So do you see that, with one in Salt Lake and one in Spokane, do you see that we could fulfill?
I do.
Okay.
I do, and I think not only do we see that opportunity, there's been another study commissioned by a different consulting firm that's specifically looked at sports tourism in Meridian, and they've also identified, this opportunity from a indoor sports tourism perspective.
And the way I would contextualize that, Chair Macau, is that, neither Spokane nor Salt Lake City is within a 4-hour drive of Boise. And so there are a lot of folks who, live within that drive catchment that, would be served by this opportunity in Boise that wouldn't necessarily be as well served by, either of those facilities, whether it be the Podium in Spokane or the Western Sports Park in Salt Lake City. So, we often see with these, as opposed to conventions, we often see with sports travel, it's a lot more drive to than it is fly to type events. Because, you think about you're getting kids in the car, you're going on a trip for the weekend, et cetera. And so, that would really be the market that we'd be looking at primarily serving with this facility.
Let's go to the next slide here. And I think really we looked again at the local event space opportunities. What we recommended on the prior slide is so substantial, and, there's a new ballroom component. So, this is an option, but we think, from a sequencing, this would be, so we'll get into the sequencing at the end of this, but, here would be the opportunity it'd be about a 30,000 square foot ballroom / flex hall. And we're seeing, this would really cater to a lot of the local events that have had to shift out of the Boise Center. You have current users that are really keen on staying, in the downtown or close proximity that could really utilize and, drive a lot of business to this type of facility. And I'll kind of jump ahead just from a big picture perspective, is we're also thinking about a performing arts opportunity. What we're seeing is actually a lot of these kind of flex halls are actually being both utilized as a ballroom space as well as a performing arts space. So you can have one hall and it's configured in one format as a theater for a performance, and there's technology where you can reconfigure it and use it as a flat floor ballroom. So there could be some utility as you think about how to, provide access to both local events through a space like that, as well as local arts organizations. And then the other kind of caveat to this local event space, the minor league baseball development opportunity, that is not downtown, but they've also, considered or proposed having an event space, not this large per se, but, that's also a consideration as well. And I mentioned, kind of the needs from a performing arts center space from a seating capacity perspective is about 1,200 seats, and that'd be the primary performance hall. And, that's smaller than the Morrison Center is currently, so it would be a little bit scaled down from that. And then also they could really, the community could really utilize a 300-seat studio and flex theater space. Again, very active, strong arts community here, and really advocating for a space that they can really, call a home. And I think it also really lends itself to where you all as a community are growing from an economic development perspective, to be able to provide cultural offerings, arts education would be really significant. The real challenge we see with a purpose-built performing arts center is it's very expensive. Of the sports is probably the most economical, convention space would be the next, and then performing arts and theater spaces are the most expensive spaces that you can pursue. And also the room night generation on a comparative basis is the lowest, because you're really servicing a local, demand base. And you might have people come in that are here for a convention, go to a show or an event, but it's not nearly as significant of a room night generator.
And for context on that, I'd refer to sort of two of our case studies. One was the Overture Center for the Arts in Madison, Wisconsin, which is a tremendous facility, and it does extremely well. But that was funded almost entirely by philanthropy, and that cost over $200 million to build in 2004. Now, it's a bigger facility than what we're talking about, but I think the upshot is that, for one thing, it's very difficult to, make the numbers work without significant sort of philanthropic sector contributions. And then for another, these facilities are very expensive. Likewise with the Miller Arts Center, which is being constructed right now in the Salt Lake County area. That's being funded almost entirely by donations from philanthropic groups within the county. So, that's where, I think we could see the auditorium district, certainly this study, I think, is hopefully helpful to that end. But for the room night challenges, for the cost challenges, it may not be sort of the strongest opportunity for GBAD from a strategic standpoint.
In those other cities where they have the performing arts centers, who owns and operates? Is it different in each?
It is different in each. And we actually, John, you could probably speak to this better since you have the report likely in front of you, but they all have, a lot of times it's a nonprofit entity or a quasi-governmental entity that operates and owns and operates these.
That's correct. So in Salt Lake City, it's Salt Lake County Arts, it's a division of Salt Lake County, but they own actually a number of different facilities: Abravanel Hall, the Capitol Theater, the Eccles Theater, the Rose Wagner and Mid Valley Performing Arts Center, the Utah Museum of Contemporary Art. So it's a little bit of a different operation because they're cross-subsidizing themselves, both through intergovernmental transfers and then also by, just pure asset portfolio diversification, right? They're running the Broadway shows, and so that helps, subsidize some of these smaller venues, likewise with the Art Museum. And then there's also a strong philanthropic base for that organization that, really helps keep things running. And then, likewise in Madison, it is opened, it is a nonprofit entity. The Overture Center is, so it is a non-governmental nonprofit, and even in that vein, again, running Broadway shows and so forth. So some of the more popular and I should say profitable programming, they lost about $4 million, $3.8 million in fiscal year 24. So. And that's on an operating basis. So they're then looking for, grants, contributions, sponsorships that cover these operating losses, as well as, making sure that they're trying to, cut expenses wherever they can. So it's a very challenging market to be in. That said, these facilities are extremely valuable for a community from a quality of life standpoint, from an economic development standpoint, thinking about resident attraction and retention. The trick is just finding the right structure to make sure that they work. And some of the structures that we've seen that have been really productive in that regard, one is in Louisville, Kentucky, with Kentucky Performing Arts. That's a division of the state of Kentucky. And so they actually receive dedicated state appropriations on an annual basis. And that's a decision on the part of the state to, essentially provide the service to its residents. It was created, by legislation back in the 1980s, and it's been operating since then. And then another model similar to Salt Lake City is in Aurora, Illinois, and that's one where they receive very minimal subsidy from the city, but it is a department of the city that owns and operates a number of venues as well as an art school within that city. And again, the way that they've really developed their financial sustainability is through diversification. So they run a lot of their own shows. They bring in touring acts. They have 4 venues that operate continuously in addition to the art school. And so the more financially profitable venues, really help subsidize some of those more community-oriented activities. So that's how that kind of balances.
And sorry, just to circle back, because I think
Sure.
you said the Salt Lake Performing Arts was a good financial model. And so what did you say how do they manage that again? Just
Yeah,
for
so-
diversity and,
Yeah, so it's owned and operated. It's a division of Salt Lake County, and they play it pretty close to the vest in terms of how much intergovernmental transfer revenue helps support those operations. But they own the arts organization, owns something like 7 regional venues. I'm trying to count them up here. In addition to the art museum. So there's economies of scale associated with operating that many venues. And it also gives them a lot of control over touring acts that come to town. If you want to play Salt Lake, they have a lot of the venues within their control. So that's a big piece of it. The other piece of it is they do have a 0.1% county sales tax that's dedicated to zoos, arts, and parks. And a small portion of that does go to those venues, but actually a lot of it goes to supporting smaller arts organizations throughout the county, and that's just administered by Salt Lake County Arts. So
And-
a number of different sources there.
And just another example is in the Denver Metro and County, they have the Science and Cultural Facilities District. So they receive a lot of funding from, the state as well as the county and the city. And they have a tiered system where, depending on the level of attendance that you generate, you're given a proportional share of support each year. And that can go towards capital as well as operations in that market. Yeah.
One clarification is, as you're talking about 4 different categories of projects, some that will increase room usage and demand, and some that wouldn't, like a local venue. But we're also looking at our hotel utilization rate being higher than our competitors. And I think even today's number was higher than the year-to-date that's in here. If we're adding 100,000 square foot space,
Yep.
and we have a few more rooms coming on, I can anticipate this being a community question as well.
Yep.
Is it prudent to introduce something when demand for hotel rooms is already high, but then we are going to increase that demand?
So typically, the sequencing that we typically see would be an organization like yours announcing a commitment for an expansion of, an exhibit hall, for example. And then that leads to the private sector really identifying, okay, there's really, there's public dollars and support going into this. And that gives them enough certainty that they are able to make investments decisions around the likelihood of that happening or not. And then also that presents another, opportunity in creating a public-private partnership. So, a lot of times what will happen, if that's the case, you do need an additional, probably a dedicated component of a new hotel's room block to support a space that large. So, there are other markets and other projects we've worked on where we've recruited a developer to develop a headquarters hotel that supports the convention center and there's usually a room block agreement associated with that. Where we are in this study process, I think it's too premature. We really don't know what direction you all as a board are going to take in terms of which of these investment opportunities are the most prudent. So I'm kind of hesitant to say that, that a new hotel is needed at this point in time.
And kind of piggybacking off of that, I had a question on 107, you have the projected growth if we did do the expansion.
Mm-hmm.
And do you know how many hotel rooms would be needed to support that additional growth?
We have not done it.
can-
Go ahead, John.
I can do that calculation fairly quickly if you want. I've got the
But before you do that, John, we have not done it, and I would like, if you're requesting us to do that, I would like to make sure we have time to put the proper structure and analytical process to it, rather than giving you just kind of a ballpark number, if that's.
Yeah. The other piece of it to consider is that, although the hotel market performance is very strong, and we'd expect it to continue to be strong given Boise Center's strength, given the Boise market strength, we have seen some minor softening within occupancy rates in the downtown market as well as in the district as a whole in the last year or so. And then that in tandem with the new AC Element adding almost 300 rooms to that downtown market, I think we would want to see where things sort of shake out. There's a significant shift. That 300 room hotel is going to be a really big component of the downtown market. And so, my expectation is that it will be absorbed, fairly comfortably within that market, and you're going to continue to see occupancies north of 70%. But, this is one of those scenarios where it's important to let that play out and let the market adjust to that, and then from there sort of reconsider, as things get further down the path, if that's the board's decision of an expansion of convention space within downtown Boise.
And, the quickest we've seen, a new, expansion happen, 18 months, that's very quick, and that takes a lot of coordination. A lot of times it could take more time than that. So once you all have committed to something in, the design process, all of those factors, that's also the time, to really think about the other support. And I believe you all have a kind of a master plan strategy that's happening as well. So, I think, there's time for that thought process to occur.
I'll add just a brief comment to the question there. In particular, strategizing how we book the facility would be kind of my strategy to that if we got additional space. So again, we've talked about the possibility of additional demand need on the weekends for the hotel, so that would be more sports. I can tell you the local groups want to come back or want to have space in there. So again, as those mixes kind of come out, we would be analyzing, hey, maybe in the first few years, if it's not driving hotel rooms, it's trying to drive revenue from the local side and give the locals more space, helping the hotels on the weekends. So again, strategy and how you operate the facility could mitigate some of that concern.
And apologies for the small size. It's, but just really wanted to talk about kind of the historical, on the top left here is a historical attendance by event type. So big picture in 2024, you had about 262 events. So we're now thinking about the new program that we've identified, that 100,000 square feet of exhibit hall space, additional ballroom space, and additional meeting room space. So, year 1 through 3 is really a ramp-up period. So by year 5 is what we consider kind of a stabilized year of operation for a new expansion, for a new venue. And basically, so going from that 262 events in total in 24 to year 5 of the new operation would increase by about 100 events in total. So 360 total events are what we're projecting in year 5. And then on the attendance side, in fiscal year 24, you had about 153,000 total attendees. And again, focusing on that year 5 of, kind of stabilized year of operations, having that increase to about 320,000 total attendees. And as we talked about, you achieve that through a variety of different approaches. One, you're able to have much larger conventions. So the number of absolute conventions might still be around the same number of events you're hosting from a conventions perspective, but they're larger. And then also being able to penetrate the trade show market. You don't have really, you have some, you actually had a food trade show here. And, you know, they're very high impact events, the trade show events. So that's a whole new business opportunity you'd be able to get into. And then also having some more of the sports and other types of events that we talked about. So there's a really discrete path for us to visualize how you can go from where you are today to the projections that we're showing in our report based on all the factors and the research that we've discussed so far. And then in terms of a financial picture of what that looks like, so here, you know, really focusing on 24's operating revenue, it's about a $12 million revenue operation and about a $14.7 million expense operation. And so really, just from an operating support perspective, you need about right around $2.75 million just from an operating support perspective from your resource base. That's not including depreciation, interest, and amortization, which is shown below to pay the debt service and the other things that are needed to support the building. So the scale of operation increases significantly. You know, you're gonna have a lot more space to sell, a lot more food and beverage to sell, and also the equipment rental and event services. But on the flip side, you're gonna have a much higher labor cost and utility costs and all the other factors from an expense perspective that are gonna also grow the expense side. So when you look at the scale of operation that we're projecting in year 5, it goes from a $12 million operation in '24 to about a $24.2 million operation from a revenue generating perspective. And then the expenses that are needed to support that level of operating revenues is about $27 million. So you actually, when you look at the net operating income or the support requirement from an operations perspective, we're looking at about a $2.8 million requirement compared to your current 2.75. So the absolute dollars that are needed from the, you know, the district to support operations is actually pretty comparable to what you're currently supporting this building at. So there's a lot to digest there, yeah.
Well, and I have a question
Sure.
that I didn't see in the report, and it kind of ties back to how many hotel rooms would need to support this.
Mm-hmm.
It's what is the projection for the tax revenue for the district? Because, you know, that plays into it as well. It's like, you know, you have your expenses go up, you're going to be outlaying this cash, but what does it look like for the income side as far as for the district? For tax
Absolutely.
revenue?
So, and we have that, and if you'd like, I can jump to that to answer that question. So let me go ahead. We have some projections for the sports complex that I can come back to that, but I do want to answer your question. So, you know, how we calculate, you know, the tax revenue throw off, you know, from the hotel rooms is really, you know, this is the process and the flow chart that we utilize and our overall methodologies outlined on the left. It looks complex, but it's fairly straightforward. So focusing on direct spending that's directly attributable to the building. Those tables on the right-hand side are multiplier effects, focusing on indirect and induced spending. So we utilize the Bureau of Economic Analysis. They have a input-output model called RIMS-2, and that's geographic based, and that's how we develop the multipliers we use. So that's how we calculate that, but we really focus on the direct spending and, you know, focusing on the fiscal impact. So the very bottom table are the various tax rates that are applicable. So you have state sales tax, which is, I think that's 6%, state lodging tax, which is 2%, and then the district tax is about 5%, is 5%. So once we go through and do all of the calculations, so first and foremost, the line I would point your attention to is the room nights here. So right now in 2024, it was about 34,000 total room nights generated by the Boise Center. And we're looking at that growing to about 75,000 in year 5 of the expanded operation. So when you think about the district and the fiscal throw off from that on an annual basis, you know, you're looking anywhere from year 1 of about $400,000 in district tax in particular based off of those room nights, increasing to about $830,000 in additional district revenues. And then, there's a lot of direct spending that's attributable to the building. And I think in addition to the fiscal revenues, right now, the Boise Center from a direct spending perspective is really attributable between 45 to 50 plus $1 million as an economic impact. So that's the economic impact this building causes. That'll also increase as you expand. So I think you want to look at more than just, the fiscal revenues, but I understand from your perspective, from the district's perspective. So we do have a bunch of information on that. But backing up a little bit, John, do you want to walk us through kind of the sports tournament, indoor sports complex information?
Yeah, absolutely. And so what you see on the screen here is, really a set of event demand projections and attendance projections for that indoor sports complex. And what they show is that we would really expect tournaments to drive the majority of that demand in terms of total attendance. And so something I mentioned was, these tournaments, especially on the regional level, can be quite large. And as a result, with, only maybe 15 to 18 tournaments on an annual basis. So you're talking about, 1.5 on a typical month, you could be driving upwards of 50,000 people through the facility. And that's everybody from, sports participants to their coaches, to their parents, et cetera. So it does become a pretty significant number. But I think the interesting thing is that, a facility like this actually has a lot of opportunity to host other types of events. And so, looking at sort of consumer shows or other public type events as an opportunity, special events, maybe in tandem with other facilities in town. Certainly league use and local type use is other opportunities. And those types of events, maybe don't necessarily drive as high of a volume of economic impact, but they can be extremely valuable for filling a facility's calendar and generating revenue. And if you switch to the next slide here, Ryan.
Yeah, and just real quick, a quick kind of Cliff Notes note about how to consider this opportunity compared to a larger convention center. This is about a third of the total operations when you compare it to the expanded convention center, both from an events perspective, an attendance perspective, revenue perspective, as well as the room nights that are thrown off from it. So that's a kind of a helpful little cheat code there.
Thanks. I can't, oh, there it is. And then, if you look at sort of what that flows into in terms of a financial profit and loss statement, we would project this to, come fairly close to breaking even upon stabilization, with some level of ramp up. The local use does generate a lot of revenue. Those tournament rental fees are pretty significant. And the upshot being, a fairly close to break even operation, which when you consider the economic and fiscal impacts, does create quite a lot of benefit for the district as well as the Boise community as a whole, as we'll get into in some of these subsequent slides. So I think if we can skip to, while we're on the indoor sports question, if we can skip to slide 32.
Yep.
Perfect. Again, per Ryan's point, that overall economic impact is smaller. We're talking about a smaller operation, but about $39 to $40 million of total economic impact on an annual basis upon stabilization, which we typically consider to be about year 5 of operations. And I think important to note within that is again that those room nights we would largely see being driven on the weekends, and so there's a real opportunity to help drive occupancy in hotels during the periods of the week when occupancy is maybe a little bit softer. The other piece of this is that, with the sports complex being proposed for indoors, what we're really talking about is an opportunity to drive occupancy during shoulder seasons, right? Because these tournaments, basketball, volleyball, et cetera, are occurring during maybe your winter February, sort of early spring periods. You're not seeing as much leisure travel during that time, maybe a little bit less business travel as well. And so, this is another sort of a benefit of the sports tournament opportunity is that, those can be really strong ways to make sure that you're still driving a lot of occupants to your hotels. You're driving a lot of folks to restaurants within the community, retail opportunities within the community, et cetera. And so that really kind of summarizes the impact opportunities for the sports complex.
And so with that, really like, where we are in this process and for next steps, I would really call our work is really the market assessment, identifying what the macro opportunities are. And then as, you all as a district go forward, there's additional planning, that's going to need to occur building off of our work. So I think some of the foundation for that follow-on work is really focusing on looking at, the convention center and the indoor sports opportunities in particular, and really thinking about, the cost, the overall development cost for those opportunities. Then also really thinking about the capital stack and where resources are going to come from. Because it's clear to us, just from our industry experience, the cash on hand from the district perspective is not enough to support in full either of these. So I think thinking creatively about how to close the gap, then also additional partners that can be identified throughout that first phase. And then going into, assuming you're able to figure out the capital strategy and development strategy, really then going into the construction component. And then as the built facilities are introduced and absorbed, our next phase, the third phase, would really take a fresh look and say, okay, now that we've added this much product to the marketplace, are there still gaps? Do we need to think about that local event space? Has the performing arts space been developed? Has another community stepped up to develop a dedicated indoor sports space? So really kind of, that's how we would flow going forward from where we are today.
And I'm assuming we can re-engage you if we go through phase one and we, dig in a little further and we identify a potential project and you could run pro formas and do all that?
Absolutely. And, typically as we go through this process with our clients, things change or you understand what the space opportunity or the land opportunity is, and there's program refinements. So absolutely, we stay typically engaged throughout, this process. And also, working with Pine Street and others can help with the capital strategy as well.
And I know you mentioned it kind of at the beginning, but I'll let you finish. I'll get back. I'll catch you.
No,
at the end.
I think I covered these really. So I don't have any other remarks, and I know we've gone, over time, so I'd love to just open it up for conversation.
Well, you just mentioned stakeholder engagement. I know we have some folks in the room and potentially possibly online, and we're going to be doing the presentation of findings. So I just kind of wanted you to chat about how that stakeholder engagement helped inform this study.
Absolutely. We really take stakeholder and organizational engagement as a very important part of what we do. It's one of the most important parts of what we do, and we really look at engagement in a couple different ways. So for this process, since we're very early on, it's important for us to understand, how the building's being used, so engaging with customers that are using the space and understanding their needs. Understanding the challenges from a building management and operations perspective, and then also talking to hoteliers, economic development organizations active in the community. We met with the city of Boise, Boise State. We met with them several, times as well. And we have a summary in our report that really outlines kind of the takeaways from those conversations. And as I mentioned, there's a couple different approaches that we take. So in the first instance, we really want to get a high-level understanding of the market opportunities and challenges. And then as we understand what those are, now that we've identified, a series of opportunities, now I think as we consider advancing those, really that in public engagement's kind of the next layer of outreach that we would typically recommend. It's not that we don't care about what the community thinks about these. That's really important to us, but we have to understand what the business opportunity is. And then once we understand that, then we can understand how the community, feels about it, how they want it to influence, where it goes, what it look, all the things that are important to community members. So it's been very important for us to understand just a business perspective. And, you look at the demand and financials that we've developed, and, there's a lot of inputs that we need. So that's really where we had to prioritize our time for this first phase of work, to make sure we have those fundamentals of operations and finance understood. And now that we have kind of the framework of what the opportunities are, I think now, we have a meeting coming up on October 16th, and that is really where we want to present, this out to the broader community, really get their input, and then also, these are still working ideas. So this is very early on in the process, so there's ample opportunity, and we welcome that opportunity to further engage with as many, organizations, community members, et cetera, as needed to support the project.
And could you list out the stakeholders up to date you've met with? I know there's going to be more down the road, but just so that the public and for my own knowledge, like who helped influence this product?
Yeah, so I do have a list of folks, and as we went through this, and as you read through the report, we were in conversations that we shared with the people that we were speaking to that, we wouldn't attribute a specific statement or idea to them just so they would speak candidly with us. But, I think as we go through, and I don't know, what your.
Yeah, I'm comfortable sharing that list. I mean, I've shared it with, I know, Don in the room here, that when we were meeting with people, so it's not out there, or it's not in the report necessarily, but we do have that list, and I'd be happy to share that with the board.
If I may add to that, the list is one thing. On your appendix for the stakeholder engagement SWOT analysis, when I read there is sentiment, it's helpful
Okay.
to know what the sentiment is out
Yeah.
there, but I don't see the data. Is there data that can be decoupled from those individuals in terms of identifying them, but that can then help me understand what the sentiment was derived from, the SWOT analysis, in other words?
So, I would like to think about how to approach that, just so I don't, if someone said something in general confidence or discretion, that I don't put them in a spot where, it's, I'm just trying to be thoughtful about how we approach that. But to your point, there's a variety of local business leaders that have a perspective and an approach. There's hoteliers that have a perspective and approach. So I completely agree that understanding, they informed part of our decision-making, but I really think it was coloring the data that we were really focused on, and also the peer facilities that we were looking at. So it was important context they provided to some of the opportunities, but, there was no specific recommendation that we recommended in our report that's directly attributable to any one of these organizations. The recommendations came from our research and the process that we used to develop our recommendations.
And I remember asking the question of, hey, I see stakeholder engagement was a little bit of a differential from the other RFPs that we got. So when I asked that question, it was really hey, we want to make sure that we don't miss any opportunities that might exist through that stakeholder engagement. So shake out, making sure what my assessment was of potential opportunities wasn't missing something. And then verifying as we got the data, kind of using that as a subset of kind of checking it against it or colorizing that data to make sure it's accurate. So in the two ways that I saw the stakeholder engagement work, it was more in that way than it was providing input into the report itself, and you guys can correct me if I'm wrong.
That's exactly right. And, we're also, we spent tens, probably, 100+ hours, with a lot of this engagement that we've done. So we spent a lot of time doing it, and I think that was more a constraint. And, if there's additional engagement that we need to, to do, we're pleased to do that. So we want to make sure this is an inclusive and comprehensive process. So, that is a commitment for us as your consultant to make sure we've done that.
I don't know if there's, I mean, we're going to have the thing on the 16th, so I don't know if there's anything more at this time until we get a little further down the road. But I think everybody's kind of sentiment is, you spent so much time meeting with all the stakeholders in the community. It's kind of like, so how does that
Fit.
show up,
Yeah.
right? And I know that some of those conversations with the stakeholders, I think like the Zoo Boise, Idaho Botanical Gardens, who are doing projects. So I think one of the thoughts was, hey, should we be a landlord and help them with the project?
Yeah.
Is that something, so I know that, I don't know if anything came out from that, it doesn't look like it based on your recommendations, but I know that those were some of the questions with the stakeholders that we, were kind of, me personally was kind of questioning, is that a road that we should be going down? So I'm not sure, if you've got, who else, you mentioned BSU, the cities. Did you meet with the Meridian Auditorium District? I know you mentioned, the potential
We did.
sports facility out there. Lots of the hoteliers.
We really
Clients, I mean,
tried to meet with as
yeah.
many people, as we could find almost, and as people thought about other groups or organizations for us, we would reach out and, either meet with them or attempt to meet with them, so.
And I'm assuming a lot of the performing arts data, was supported by meeting with those local
Absolutely.
stakeholders.
So understanding their demand calendars, what their specific use needs are, both from a presentation perspective as well as rehearsal perspective, some of their pricing constraints. So yes, we have a lot of kind of broad information from a lot of different organizations about how they would use specific spaces.
And kind of to your point, kind of on the additional, those other smaller kind of opportunities, what I was really looking for and try to drive from this report would be, let's look at our biggest opportunities, and if these don't make sense, then I would continue to engage those smaller ones, because if the data came back and said that these aren't feasible or reasonable to do, then that might then point us in that direction. But when I was seeing so much data going, the big stuff is feasible and there's multiple options there that support room nights, revenue generation, all the things that the district is here for, that's where we kind of pointed that. But I still think there's opportunities to reengage that opportunity if we don't feel any of these are viable.
Touching on how do we use these spaces, can you talk a little bit about the case study here? I'm curious how Salt Lake has $2 million more in operating expenses than we do, and they manage 720,000 square feet, and it's only a $2 million difference, and they have a positive revenue at 3.8 million. How are they doing that, and how do we replicate that?
Yeah, that's the point. And John, do you want to maybe take the first pass and then I can follow in with that?
Yeah, sure. And excuse me because I'm pulling up the page of the report with those numbers
Me
on
too.
it so that thank you. So that I can refer to those specifically.
Some of my assumptions, and I'll let Johnson jump in here, but would be food and beverage. They don't do in-house food and beverage, so they're not covering those expenses. They have parking revenue, I believe, so there's additional revenue sources for them. But I'll let them jump in and answer that, but those are just things that jump out to my mind of knowing the markets.
Exhibit space, a lot of exhibit space.
Right. So a lot of exhibit space, and that's part of it. But with that larger exhibit space, because you would say based on their square footage, well, they're X number of times the size of Boise Center, say over 10 times the size of Boise Center. Why don't they generate 10 times the amount of revenue? One component of that is it's a different strategy when you're looking at a facility of that size, right? Your goal is to fill that space to the degree that you can. And so that will drive, larger facilities like that to, essentially discount rent on a per square foot basis. So they're generating, $29 of revenue per square foot of total exhibit space on an annual basis. But the goal being to get as many attendees through there as they can. In terms of specific data, the top line operating revenues and expenses were as detailed as we were able to acquire from them. They're not required to report those data specifically. So this was sort of, this is as detailed as we could get. But the parking revenue, as Cody mentioned, is going to be another big component of that. So I would say it's those two things primarily, because again, revenue does not scale proportionately with square feet. And then every organization and every building is a little bit different in terms of how they actually sort of structure the revenues coming in and out of their convention center. So, having parking be a part of that is a big differentiator.
And do they have a management company that runs that?
They do.
Like
They
Oak
use ASM Global or now Legends. The two companies actually just merged, or I guess it was an acquisition. So it's now called Legends as of a couple of weeks ago.
So if I can ask a clarifying question, then it sounds like the case we're making for Salt Lake is that their strategy is utilization, which was our prior strategy, which we've departed from, and now we're more on a revenue optimization strategy, which has helped our financials. So fundamentally different strategy, and their capacity and ability for infrastructure, airport, and hotel rooms. So those are very, very different.
So I would say their strategy is economic impact, not necessarily utilization, right? If utilization is just how many days can we fill the convention center, or how many events can we bring in, their goal is how many large events can we bring in that get people in town from out of town and generate spending locally. And so that's, I would say, more akin to what we've seen at Boise Center in the last couple of years, where the goal has been to chase those large events. So utilization in the sense that they're looking for groups to buy out their exhibit hall, but not utilization in the sense that they're looking for just how many events can we run through here on an annual basis.
And so another, excuse me, point to that, too, in 2024, for example, their budget target for revenue was about 13.7 million, and they actually achieved 20 million. So that's where the differential came from. And a lot of that is from parking. And the other large source of that is overperformance in their food and beverage by a huge amount. So, they must have had that year conferences or conventions that really went over and above in the food and beverage. So that budget, total revenue budget was 13.7, and their total expenditure budget was about 17.8. So they were actually planning for a loss, as kind of John was outlining how they're structuring their pursuit of how they buy business or support business coming into the market. So, and we can share, the actual data sets that we have from these buildings if you'd like to dig kind of line item by line item for the various case studies.
Starting to become pretty interested in parking.
Well, parking is can be a very lucrative.
Yeah.
We would say that is probably one of the most, if you're seeing a building that has an operating profit, it's usually due to parking.
Yeah, that's we worked on a facility in Fort Wayne, Indiana, that 40% of their annual revenues were attributable to parking. So that's they had an arena, so there's different things driving that, but it can be a really meaningful thing for a facility like this, and especially in an environment where folks are starting to get their heads around being charged for parking. It can be a huge driver of revenue.
And the other scenario where you see a building, you're scratching your head, how are they making an operating profit? So we're working in Erie, Pennsylvania right now, and they have an authority, and I don't think you're able to do this, but the authority actually owns 2 adjacent hotels that are interconnected. So that is a huge cash, resource to them to be able to support their operations. So
yeah. Similarly, McCormick Place in Chicago, the public authority that owns and operates that convention center, they own the 2 connected hotels and that. So they show a break even every year, but the reality is that the hotels make a whole lot of money, and then they rent the building out for very little. With the goal being to fill the hotels as well as to fill other hotels and bring people into the city.
And that's where I mentioned it's, a challenge for us as we think about these different buildings and their operating, profile, because there is no standard chart of accounts like a hotel. So, You have to go in and really do surgery, interviews with the team, the management team, to really understand, the line items in particular. And I really wish at some point the convention industry could shift to having a standard chart of accounts. And I know we've talked about it at IEVM, about switching to something like that.
A question about the exhibit space. 100,000 square feet seems to be the sweet spot, but I noticed that Madison and there's other convention centers that have smaller exhibit spaces and still have success. Is there a fallback? I mean, if we found some land or something at some point, but it couldn't support 100,000 square feet, is there another number where we could, we're not going to get those big conventions, but.
So I think from your growth trajectory and just what you're missing currently compared to others, you're in a catch-up mode, in my judgment. So let's say, you settled on a number of 50,000, half the amount of exhibit space. You will be in a position within, I would say, 3 to 5 years of really wanting to have double that amount of exhibit space. So going through the complexity of proving that additional need and then also figuring out how to expand in a very challenging market. So how I would recommend looking at it is that 100,000 square feet of exhibit space is probably what we would suggest to be the minimum. So I think you could actually do more than that. Sure, you could do less and you'd still have a lot of benefits, but if you're going through the complexity of figuring out this puzzle, you might as well try to get as much, as possible to get you closer. Because, a lot of those other buildings we identified, they have expansion plans to go over, that amount. And so that's where I would just caution, thinking smaller than that. Land availability is a huge challenge, so maybe you do just from that perspective, but.
And I'd really point to the demand and the usage of Boise Center East from how quickly we filled that, how quickly we absorbed it. So again, I think putting these little pieces into it, while they can be successful, it's leaving a lot on the table, so.
Adding just the recommendation doesn't get us up to Spokane's available space per the population. It does get us to Des Moines, but adding both of the recommendations still has us way below Salt Lake. Now, a lot more population, but they have a ton of square footage per population. It's crazy.
Yeah. And Salt Lake's a fascinating market too. It's a little bit unique in terms of the profile of their economy, the wealth that's present there, as well as the airlift that you see with Salt Lake and the tourism impact of that. It's a little bit, even though again it was interesting because Boise isn't that much smaller, but you would consider Salt Lake to be a little bit of a higher tier market. Thinking about.
Or even a much higher tier market.
Right. The presence of, sports and entertainment, et cetera, within that community, its national prominence, et cetera. So it's sort of a fascinating one, but they've done very, very well in the conventions business in recent years and have really kind of translated that into a lot of success. It's the success in their tourism and their population growth that has enabled them to invest in all of those arts facilities, right? So it becomes kind of a virtuous cycle for the community.
Well, and you look at where you're going to be in 20 years. I think that's an important consideration as well. I mean, will you be a Salt Lake? I don't know, but I mean, you're really at a point in time, where you're growing and, matching these opportunities to the growth of the community, I think is a really important consideration as well. And, in my experience in some markets like Erie, they're landlocked, so they have one opportunity to expand their current convention center. And so, their population, they have a lot of challenges in that marketplace, but they have a surprising amount of hospitality infrastructure. So they're taking an approach of, we have one opportunity to really do this to maximize what our future footprint can be. And, I think, in a sense, that's them future-proofing, the conditions that surround them, from being landlocked and having limited real estate to work with. So probably expanding more than they should in this short term, but thinking about how their business has grown with the existing facility and how your building has grown with the existing facilities is, you know, you have proof that as you add space, it's getting consumed and it's at a high consumption rate. So I just can't emphasize that enough, where you're growing as a community.
Yeah, and I would reiterate that, again, the lost business data, while extremely powerful and valuable, doesn't necessarily capture the full scope of impacts of the missing events due to a lack of space. Because, one of the easiest things to find out about a convention center is how big it is, right? And that'll be, something that a lot of meeting planners identify and say, well, it's not big enough, so we're not even going to consider it, and then it never becomes a lost need.
So I just kind of summarized, in year 5, doing like the exhibit hall versus the sports, and track if I've got this right. So the attendee days for the exhibit hall would be 611,916, and the sports would be around 220.
Let me pull that up. I gotta get back to it.
Going through my report right now.
And what, sorry, I know you're looking at 2 different pages, but what were the numbers you just referenced?
So the attendee days, and we're like 611,916 for an exhibit hall or expansion, and then the sports would be 220.
Yeah, although note that the expansion, we're talking about in addition to the existing 280 odd or 279 or so. So the incremental on that in a year 5 is more like 330,000 incremental attendee days relative to maybe a 220,000. So it's still a larger opportunity, but not by the order of magnitude of triple
Okay.
necessarily.
So I guess, so are all these numbers then similar, like the room night, 75,000 versus 27?
Would be my guess.
Yeah, so you're right now
Right,
doing.
we're talking about the total, right, with the
So
expansion?
30, yeah,
Yes.
that's including,
Okay,
yeah.
Yeah.
so it's
Yep.
not apples
Not
to apples?
incremental.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
Because that's why the numbers look so much bigger, because I'm looking at,
Yes.
185 million economic impact versus 39.
No, yeah, that's,
Right. When you consider that you're currently doing, something in the range of $80 million of economic impact at the Boise Center, you get to see sort of the difference of what we're talking about.
Okay.
And again, going back to Ryan's previous point, we often do see, facilities kind of serving both of these needs, right? A lot of convention centers do host a high volume of sporting events in their exhibit hall. It's flat floor space, it's high ceiling, it fulfills a lot of those needs, checks a lot of those boxes.
And your recommendation for either of these, or if it's one, would be as close to the Boise Center as possible?
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, if you think about, and I think specifically with the convention space expansion, if you think about, you have this high performing convention asset already, you have an extremely high performing convention district. I remember when we came out to the market several months ago, that data had just been pulled by Visit Boise, was the conversion rate of meeting planners who came to the market for a tour of the facility in the market, and I think it was above 80%. So that sort of speaks to the quality of downtown as a convention environment, the quality of Boise Center in terms of its facility, and so I think adding on to that rather than trying to develop that same level of quality from a tourism perspective in a different area of the community makes a lot of sense to us. On the indoor sports complex side, it's a little bit less critical in our mind that it be directly downtown, and that's for a couple of reasons. One is, downtown is a great environment for conventions, and it is a good environment for families as well. But as you all know, it's a lot more sort of some higher end restaurants and bars, entertainment, etc. Not necessarily what we always see as being the most conducive to sports tourism, which is maybe more chain type restaurants, your Applebee's, your Chili's, etc., that are a little bit more affordable, a little bit more family friendly. Some sort of less expensive hotel inventory as well, and then easier driving access. So these aren't folks necessarily who are flying in. So not to say that an indoor sports complex can't work downtown, and not to say that those indoor sports events wouldn't work in a downtown environment because, there's a high degree of safety, there's a high degree of quality, and there still are those family-friendly options, but it's not as crucial in our mind as it would be to make sure that, convention opportunity continues to be concentrated within that convention district environment that's been performing so well.
Yes, yes. And, why you are so successful is, what happens when you walk out the door. But I think, again, hearkening back to how we approach this is, throughout the market, you are able to support 100,000 square feet of incremental exhibit space. Our preference and a meeting planner's preference would be to have that in Boise Center, adjacent to Boise Center, as close to downtown as possible. But, we think you're that short on exhibit space from a facility or a market-wide perspective. So you
And I would
could.
just highlight from a building operator standpoint or booking strategy, having a building that may not be in the downtown core as close, then challenges us to book it for additional convention space, even if they wanted a campus concept or if it was attached. Again, to that point before about kind of strategizing, hey, right now the hotels are looking for more weekend occupancy, then we can strategize to kind of go towards that. If it's outside of the downtown core, using it for more convention activity becomes much more of a challenge.
A lot of information we've, presented, so I don't know if there's additional questions that you all
Any more
have.
questions at this time? It's a lot. The report is over 100 pages, and for those in the audience, it's on our website. So if you wanted to go there and download the whole thing, please feel free. It's, Mary Michael, you may help me out. It's, do we have a new web page? We have a new web
I
page.
can speak to this real quick.
And it's, I've got it here, Future Visions webpage, right? Is that
Yeah,
what
I
it's
can
called?
speak to this
Future
as well.
Visions.
I got notes here, Mayor Michael, thank you. Just real quick, yes, the district's Future and Vision page is on the website, so if you get under the district website and click on the top under additional, which is what's it under, Mary Michael, now that I called it, how'd you sit down? District Overview, it'll drop down and it'll have a Future Vision page of the district, and that's where we're gonna be housing all the information as we continue to release more information, the reports. It kind of shows a roadmap of where we're at. Obviously, next steps, and I'll kind of get into that now. With the insights of this report, our board can hopefully better articulate the vision for the future of the district as they update the strategic plan. So that's kind of the step that we're going into next on that. And that'll be kind of listed out as the next step on that section of the website. I'd also point out too that we'll put up the presentation today because that presentation did have page numbers referencing into those reports. And I know it was small on the screen, so I want those folks in the audience today to be able to go back and look at that data in a much more clear way. So we will make sure that that's out there as well. But the report itself is up on the website as of now, so it is public.
Yeah, so I think, from the board's perspective, we're gonna just spend some time digesting all this information. We'll have the thing on the 16th.
Yep.
And everybody, hopefully, I think there was an invite that went out to all the stakeholders. So feel free to spread that far and wide. It'll be in room 420 from 2 to 4 on the 16th. You guys will be here to do a more condensed presentation and
Correct.
then answer questions, correct?
Absolutely, yep.
Yeah. And then we will start our strategic plan with this information in mind. And then, if we come up with any other questions, it sounds like they're open to maybe, if you wanted the information, line by line from Salt Lake, then we can,
We absolutely are
Great.
open to that, yep.
okay. So, yeah, this is the start of it, right? All right. Anything else, board?
I do, one question about community input. I know we have October 16th. Are there other opportunities for people who cannot be on premise day of?
Thank you. Yes, so we're actually going to be recording that event and posting it up online.
You mean like live? Will it be Zoom that they
We're
can
not- I
log
don't think
into
we were
live?
planning on a Zoom component. No, we were going to record it, so those that couldn't be able to attend. If it is an interest from the public to have it online on a Zoom where you could virtually attend, that's something that I'm sure we could accomplish with very little resources, so.
And then if anybody has input or questions, to email you, Cody?
Yes,
Reach out to you.
absolutely.
So community, if they have, after
Yeah.
reading the report, if they have questions, reach out to Cody and he'll filter those and we'll get it answered. So thank you for all your work on this. I know it was a substantial project and we appreciate all the data and the input.
Great, well,
It's,
thank you,
yeah.
really,
And you
really
hit-
enjoyed serving you all, so.
Hit your 50th state.
Yeah, exactly, yep. It's a huge milestone for us, so.
I'll just take a minute to say thank you to the board for supporting. I know I'm a big data-driven decision guy, supporting this option and this kind of approach. And then just thank the folks over at Johnson Consulting for their professionalism. They came highly recommended. I'll also thank Pine Street Group, who helped with the RFP process. It's been a really extensive process, and I think that's necessary. And so I just appreciated the support through this. And again, we're going to continue. And those my team that know me, I'm measured twice or 3 times before I cut once. And I think this is very much kind of in line with that. And I just appreciate the support from the board in that way. So.
Great, thank you. We'll see you again in October. And again, reach out to us if you have any questions or input on the data. Great, meeting's adjourned.